The following podcast is brought to you exclusively by the Rad Rob Radio Network. He's a member of wrestling royalty. His repertoire and skills in the ring are unmatched. He's always been loyal, trustworthy, and has a work ethic that is unparalleled. He's been bashed by his peers, by the media, and even by the fans. But he's living proof that our worst days do not define us, and neither can other people. Welcome to Rebuilding the Foundation with Teddy Hart.
Teddy, you mentioned your grandfather teaching you some stuff like that, and we've seen Brett in videos, work out and roll around with your grandfather. Did Stu ever teach Brett how to be a shooter?
Yeah, all the guys learned submission stuff in the basement. That's natural. But again, I think Brett, as a shooter, was probably not as good as Owen. I think Owen was a better amateur wrestler, collegiate. Owen was an actual university champion. I think Brett won the high school wrestling championships in the city, which was still a pretty crazy accomplishment. But he wasn't as well versed. It was more like I say, Brett got that reputation because of what Stu was, right? So Stu being such a good shooter, it translated to Brett and the storyline and a narrative that they like to push, that the guys from the dungeon were shooters, and they all, they were, but not on the same level as my grandfather. You know what I mean? If I was giving my grandfather was a 12 out of 10 as a shooter. Brett was probably a 7 out of 10. Owen was probably a 9 out of 10, or he was a much higher level. And, I think the generation, like I say, Keith Hart was a good amateur wrestler. I think Smith was a decent amateur wrestler and a good shooter too. I was told, the oldest son, but I have one. I don't disagree with Matt about breaking guys in, but I also want to clarify, when you're a professional wrestler, your job is to make sure that move looks as good as you possibly can make it without hurting the guy. But it's also an art, and that's an expert black belt getting to that level. You shouldn't be in the ring if you don't know what you're doing, and that's the problem. A lot of untrained wrestlers that don't have the right training. So when Matt says what he's saying, he's not saying he wants to hurt a pro wrestler that's already trained. What he's saying is some idiot that gets in the ring without the right respect or fundamental training or idea of what it takes to make this work and make it look right. That's when you get your ass stretched a bit, because you're going in and acting like what we're doing is a joker. It's easy because you're getting confused by the word fake instead of fixed. Now, fixed means the ending is predicted. The rest of the shit, you go talk to Gravity. If you know who she is or who he is, if you can find him or the entity and explain to him that I really want my arm to bend up my ass and I want to be able to jump off 25 feet on my head and not get touched because I want it to be fake so nothing hurts. And then my body, when I land on the concrete off of 3 feet or 5 feet or 10 feet or 20, it feels pretty rock solid to me. Like it's pretty dangerous. That's just one type of wrestling. Get into the other stuff. Try a pile driver on a guy that doesn't know what he's doing. And the guy's got his head up instead of head down, and all of a sudden you drop him thinking he's safe. Guy breaks his fucking neck. Now it's your fault because you're the dance partner that didn't know what you're doing. It's like, no. That's not the case. I knew what I was doing. You got a bad partner, he could kill you. It's like having a co-pilot, and you want to take a break, and the co-pilot doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. That's where someone gets hurt, and that's why you give guys an ass kicking when they get in the ring at first, because it instantaneously weeds out the fucking guys that are serious and the guys that are dreamers. And now wrestling's all about providing a dream for a wrestling school for some weird guy that's got likes watching guys run around in shorts. Most of these guys are weird. I wonder what the motivation is for actually promoting shows and being in that business, because they never took a bump in their life, yet they act like they've been around the business and they know everything. They watched a few WWE videos, and so, but yeah, definitely. I just wanted to clarify, hurting someone in the ring is definitely incorrect as a pro to pro, but bringing a bunch of young, impressionable marks or people that think pro wrestling is a joke or some capacity where they go into it not understanding or not having the right appreciation, that's when, you stretch the living shit out of that guy and you teach him a lesson about how it really could be and what would happen in a real situation, because usually we're trained to make it real and fixed. It's what our job is. We can do both things. An MMA fighter, a lot of them transfer over as great pro wrestlers because they have a background in all these different holds. It becomes more natural. You don't have to be a shooter to be a good professional wrestler. Not at all. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying you're definitely more well versed if you have an MMA background before you get into pro wrestling. That's why amateur wrestlers, it's still MMA, a lot of amateur wrestlers get into pro wrestling and they've automatically got a comfortability level with it, and they do a lot better and they progress a lot faster with the training. For example, Kurt Angle, Ken Shamrock, Dan Severn, all guys that were able to get into pro wrestling fairly quickly and without a lot of experience, having matches that look like they were 5-star guys.
I mean, yeah, you can say the same thing about Brock Lesnar and how great he was.
Sorry, Brock.
You know, how great he was in Minnesota, right? And then he goes to WWE, and you know, he's the next big thing. And then when he's tired of doing that, he doesn't want to travel. He goes to UFC, and because of his collegiate background of being one of the best, you know, amateur wrestlers in the world, he's UFC world champion. Did you expect that, King? I mean, when you knew he was getting into MMA and going to the UFC, did you expect Brock to go to the top?
Yeah, Brock was trained. His coach was Eric Paulson that I did my book with, and I was training with Eric before he ever trained Brock, and he was also part of Greg Nelson, and then his old coach from Minnesota with Minnesota Martial Arts. But Eric was his main coach. So I knew he would do well, but you got to remember, like with Dan and Ken, they were pro wrestlers first, and you also people need to understand, and that's why people need to read the Rough and Tumble book, is that MMA came out of professional wrestling. And I recently interviewed Art Davie, who was the creator and founder of the UFC in 1993 with Jorge and Gracie. And he said a great quote, which is so true, which is the most successful professional wrestling organization in the world right now is the Ultimate Fighting Championships. I actually say it's One Fighting Championships because they're even bigger out of Asia. But MMA is just an extension of professional wrestling. And I think that a lot of professional wrestling people don't understand their roots. And I know obviously Teddy Hart does. I mean, God, he's part of the Hart family going back to Stu Hart. But I think one of the reasons that you lead guys out and you have the Carney challenges where you stretch guys in the ring is to teach them respect and the roots of professional wrestling. And anyone who hasn't done so needs to listen to The Undertaker when he was on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he talked about how he got into professional wrestling with Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer. And I'll give you a little trivia for your listeners. Buzz Sawyer, and I found this out from Dan Severn. We actually talked about it when he was on. I've had him on my old podcast, and then I had him on Berman Law Group in studio with me because we've done a lot of coaching clinics together over the last 20 years. And he said, you know who he beat? He outpointed, and he beat by 1 point in the semifinals of high school nationals. His senior year was Buzz Sawyer. Wow. So Buzz Sawyer was a great amateur wrestler, but there's so many. I mean, you know, people like to try to say, you know, Dan Severn, Ken Shamrock. Go back and study professional wrestling. Read the book. You had to be a tough shooter to get into the business. And that's what the business is based on. It started as a shoot, moved to a work, and then created the shoot. That is what mixed martial arts is today. And mixed martial arts is a fairly new word too. When I started competing in it in the 90s, it was called no holds barred. So the whole concept of mixed martial arts is even a new word, and it's all wrestling, man. I mean, it's wrestlers that dominate, and that's what Jake Shannon. We just had him on Old School Shooters, and he was talking about his scientific wrestling program. You know, those OU football players that just got beat up, that video that went viral that Rogan was talking about, the Brown brothers, those are students of Jake Shannon. They're a scientific wrestling affiliate gym. So wrestling it's all wrestling, man. It's all wrestling. And people need to take pride in being a professional wrestler. And
would you not agree with
goes back to,
wouldn't it be listeners, people aren't understanding. He's trying to teach you a principle that wrestling's like the base sport for all sports to start from the beginning of time. Cavemen would have been wrestling. Bears would be wrestling. Tigers are wrestling. It's a natural progression of what humans are or species on Earth. It's like, so it all comes from that. And what he said, guys, is to have respect for whatever you do. The lesson is whatever you do, have pride in your work. And if your work is a wrestler, then have pride in learning as much about the business, which is the shooter, the submission, the theatrical side. There's a many sides to the wrestling, but if you learn 3 things, you know the 4th thing is what's going to make you got to learn all 4, and that's what wrestling is. It makes you learn about all sorts of different things because it's such a multifaceted sport. So my thing that I took out of what you said was have pride in your work and have pride in what you're doing on any level, and that's what pro wrestling as a system to teach men and women. Because it's men and women now, guys. And women were again, in pro wrestling, women were a huge part of pro wrestling. It's the way they could get into anything. There was no other sports that was allowing women. There's no NBA basketball. There's no other, there's all these sports for girls now. Back in the day, there wasn't a lot of things besides, I think, female baseball is about it. And that, so now all of a sudden you got all the girls that are amazing athletes and very tough and very educated and very, very respectful. And they take great pride. I think a lot of the girls take more pride in what they're doing than the guys. It's just they don't have the right training because they're pushed on TV a little too soon. But take pride in your work and have respect for what you're doing. That'll make you a much better student, which becomes a teacher, becomes a master after a while. And then you got your doctor's degree in professional wrestling. That usually will give you an understanding of how to live your life as a more successful person navigating this earth.
Yeah, and I have to say something with respect to women's professional wrestling. We had Nigel Sherrod on Old School Shooters recently, and the reason we had him on is because I used to train MMA fighters going back to 2008, 2009, when I was the captain head trainer for Capital MMA in South Carolina, and we used to train fighters out of a ring that was like a pride ring. It was a big boxing ring. It was in a barn. And the woman who owned the ring was Susan Green. She was Susan Texgreen from professional wrestling. Billy Wicks actually introduced me to her, and she was one of Moolah's girls going back to the day. And she's very adamant, and as Nigel, when we had him on, that Moolah, much like Teddy Hart, was really just lampooned with this whole thing, with all the negative press about her. Susan Green didn't have that experience with Moolah at all, and neither did a lot of these women. And it was a lot of these women that were disgruntled, like Wendy Richter, that maybe had a cup of coffee in professional wrestling during the Rock and Roll Connection, attacking Moolah. But I want to go back in time to another one of my mentors and coaches in submission wrestling, and also who was known as a pro wrestler, who was a good friend of Billy Wicks, was the great Mephisto, Frankie Kane. And he knew Billy Wolf, and he told me Billy Wolf was the one who was married to Mildred Burke. You're going way back in time in women's wrestling now. And he told me that if you wanted to get in wrestling, Billy Wolf was going to fuck you, and he was probably going to smack you around. So he was like a pimp of all these girls, and they put all that on Moolah. Man, I'll tell you, I lived I had a place in Columbia, South Carolina for 14 years, and I met a lot of the Ellison family, the late great Moolah's family, and I don't feel that at all. I think that she was railroaded, and she got caught up in that whole quote unquote believe the woman thing with the Me Too. Yeah. It's like, it was just like believe the woman, whatever she says. It was so irrational. I was like, no, we're not going to look at the facts. We're just going to believe the woman. And WWE, of course, canceled the Fabulous Moolah Invitational event and named it after Mae Young. And I think that was disgusting. When you look at women's wrestling, I think Moolah was great, and that's why I say, and I go back to what I said in the beginning, and I want people to listen to this poem, in Men Whom Men Condemn as Ill, or Women, whom men condemn as ill. I find so much of goodness still in men whom men deem half divine. I find so much of sin and blot. I hesitate to draw the line between the two where God has not, because we live in this hyper judgmental world with this cancel culture, man. And Teddy's been a victim of it. Moolah was a victim of it. And I say, take a step back and stop throwing stones, man. It says that in the Bible. Don't throw stones. Look at yourself. People who judge other people are usually have the most shit on them. They're trying to direct attention away from them onto other people.
King, what is it about the current wrestling fan, especially if you're on social media, and it's like Twitter is a cesspool, and wrestling fans today aren't like the wrestling fans that we grew up with in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. They're all keyboard warriors. They all have a platform where they can say whatever they want with no repercussions.
They're all weirdos too. They're weirdos too. The way that they watch, I think that comes down to the way that they watch wrestling.
Right.
You want to draw them into watch wrestling so that they want to see it as a fight, like who's going to win, and they look at it like they're working for the company, like they're booking them. That's why I say, we need to go back to the Carney days and start stretching these punks. Yeah. I love what Jerry Bragg was doing, and I was part of it. And when he brought in little TJ, you should have seen the expression on these kids' faces, when they're staring up at the lights and getting their asses kicked. They go back and they tell people, and that's really what we need to go back to, that because it's the way that they watch it, and then they all seem to be these SJ social justice warrior type people.
Yes.
And I don't know where that came from, man. I mean, pro wrestling fan back in the day, used to be the beer swilling, they want to see a fight. And that it just became this weird crowd, man. I don't know. Teddy, what do you think about that?
I think once you gave them some kind of control or mechanism for them to have a point to complain about, all of a sudden now everyone's a promoter, booker, and they all know what's best, and everybody wants to. This world's become negative, and people love to hate, and it's so sad because I'm finding they're creating. I'm hoping that this is the way it works, that a lot of the guys that were hated on incorrectly. Now, if you did it, you did it. But if you can't prove it, you didn't do it. And still saying you're guilty, to me, apostasy, and that's it. We stood up for living in America, Canada, but country that we're supposed to have these things built into society so that this type of behavior is not allowed to happen. And now you have people judging you for things that never happened, and you're innocent, you're guilty until proven innocent. And to me, it's just a shame. And I'm hoping that allows some comebacks to happen, though, so that they buried a few of these guys. And America seems to love killing people off, but then they love the comeback. So I'm hoping that I can give them both. You guys have completely annihilated the character of Eddie Hart, tried to kill the man. And but the myth and the legend of the Hart family, the myth is that wrestling is some kind of, now it's a dance and it's not real. Well, guess what? You know what, guys? I added gravity and I added a lot of technique to try to make wrestling as real as possible. So when you watch my stuff, you understand there's a way of doing it right. And I consider myself one of the best wrestlers in the world because I had a shooter background. And I understood technique, and I understood what it took to be a multifaceted wrestler. It's an acrobat, it's a spokesman, it's a public speaker, it's an actor, and it's also an athlete and a shooter, and it's a wrestler having all these, this language, alphabet of different holds to do. Well, guess what, guys? Like I say, learning anything takes time, and it takes time and energy to get to a certain level to be a great pro wrestler. And the schools now that are teaching pro wrestling, I think MMA professional wrestling school, they should be the same school, and then you get into both. There's no reason you can't teach an MMA fighter how to pro wrestle at the same time, and there's no reason why the wrestling guy can't learn some MMA holds. Every practice I started, my first hour of practice is let the kids run around the ring, and all of them climb up to the top ropes, and they all get to jump on that. Once that's over, they've all gotten their fun, and every single guy shoot fights after that. And it's submission. There's no punching, but it's full submission. Every single day, me and Keith would teach those kids how to shoot fight. And they would all shoot, and it caused you'd see that these guys would go crazy trying to get the submission on the other guy. Nobody wanted to lose, and it sure accelerated the class for quality. And every kid became a shooter, and they naturally started doing submission holds between their rest holds. So, and they automatically knew. And it was funny, the natural instinct of a human being to protect their neck or to do some of these things that are, because that's the way to do it. It's a natural instinct. Professional wrestling is a natural instinct of how to defend yourself. And then if you know what works, like I say, then that's the master. That's the technique of getting to a certain level. But I'm trying to create a black belt level where it's a gymnast, it's a wrestler, it's an acrobat type of feeling to not to everybody, but that these guys are welcome to learn all aspects of professional wrestling. And one of them is shooting. And one of them is also how to conduct yourself as a representative of professional wrestling or MMA. And that's to be a good person. It goes right back down to the same morals. If you don't have respect, you don't understand where it came from, then do your homework as a fan. And the history should make you more educated on where it came from and why it's so important to maintain respect, because respect is one of the key values that's, I think, being lost now in translation. New generation of people, respect and etiquette and chivalry, women and chivalry, your common man beside you.
I got to tell you guys a story, man, that's right along the lines of what Teddy's saying, and it actually involves Teddy's uncle, the hitman, Bret Hart. So Stephan Bonnar, when he was transitioning into professional wrestling, and I had managed Stephan during his and towards the end of his career, and I worked for Bellator. I was a prime marketing consultant during the end of Bjorn Rebney's tenure when it was bleeding over to Scott Coker, and we did I was trying to set up with Stephan to have the Stephan Forrest Griffin fight, right? Because that was the one that was fireworks that got all the ratings. So this was when Spike TV had Bellator, and all the fight fans were tuning into Spike. So we were trying to get with Bellator. We were trying to get some of the UFC stars moved over. So that was during the Stephan Bonnar. We created the Stephan Bonnar Tito Ortiz fight, which Stephan, man, R.I.P. brother. I talk about on every podcast. He was the man. He created that whole deal with Sean McCulley, that promo in the cage with Tito. That was fireworks that bled into that, and we didn't even Spartan Tito up for that. He knew what Tito's reaction was going to be, and that set up for the Tito Ortiz Stephan Bonnar fight, which is the only time still to this day that Bellator beat UFC head to head in the ratings on a television broadcast. It was Spike TV versus Fox when they had moved over. So when I got Bonnar into pro wrestling, his first pro wrestling match I booked him for was at House of Glory in New York City for their big summer show. And it was supposed to be against Matt Riddle. And going into that, man, Bonnar and I actually shared a room. The promoter put us up in Queens. And that's a funny story, too, that hotel. It was all Mexican neighborhood, and Bonnar looked like a giant. He looked like Herman Munster, and we had a lot of fun. And then I don't want to, some of the stories I don't want to tell, but we had a great time in that neighborhood, partying and stuff. So when he goes to me like the night before, he goes, Riddle's not showing up. He's putting nothing on his social media. Because Bonnar was the man from Ultimate Fighter. Everybody, him and Forrest Griffin were the guys that built the sport. And Riddle had come out of Ultimate Fighter. This was before he was signed with WWE. And he had nothing on his social media. Nothing about the match. So we get a call about 3 hours before we're going to the building. And Bret Hart, Teddy's uncle, was hosting the event. For House of Glory, that event at New York City Arena. So we get a call from the promoter. Oh, Riddle, he pulled a muscle. He's not, they made up some story, whatever. And so we started cutting promos on Riddle and putting them on Bonnar's social media. So we go, well, what's going to happen? We're here. And they go, well, I'm trying to find a replacement opponent, So we get there to the building. We still don't have a replacement opponent, right? So we're in the back with Bret Hart because Bret was the special guest. He was going to be signing autographs. And Bret actually said to Stephan, he goes, because Stephan starts talking, we were talking to Bret about how Riddle didn't show up, and he says, "Oh, wrestling's a cutthroat business. This kind of stuff happens." Well, they put Bonnar with a guy named Sho Tanaka, who was a Japanese MMA fighter who'd had some MMA fights. And his pro wrestling, like he had just wrestled Kazushi Sakuraba. So that tells you everything you need to know about this guy. He could do a shoot style match. And just like Teddy said, I was broadcasting that show. I called their match, and man, we're in the back, and the guy doesn't speak a word of English. And that was a great match because they spoke in the language of wrestling. They went out there and they wrestled. And I've wrestled Stephan Bonnar. You can see a mixed tag match. I wrestled Bonnar a couple of times. You see a mixed tag match I did with him on Hannibal. It's the one we did with if you put, it's not an intergender match, but if you type in UFC Bonnar intergender, you'll see it. It's got like 12,000 views on Hannibal. It's a match with some gorgeous girls who came from beautiful ladies of oil wrestling that we were tagged with. But Bonnar, when you wrestle him in pro wrestling, you had to wrestle. That's why I wanted to wrestle him. So I brought him in there, and he and Sho had a great match. Sho Tanaka. And that just kind of shows you what Teddy was saying. You speak the language of wrestling. If two guys can wrestle, they don't have to talk. They don't have to really work and plan it out. You get in the ring and you go in and wrestle. And a guy brought guys in off the amateur mat that I coached, like Steve Alponi and Shane Lee, who was wrestling at Citadel, to wrestle me. And you go in the ring and you wrestle. And that's like I say, that's what it says on the marquee, man. And Teddy understands that. He's got that rich lineage, but Teddy's also so exciting. And that's why I say professional wrestling, the acrobatic aspect is a huge part of it because it's a show, right? And you want to entertain, but I really think that if you bring the shoot aspect, and people say you can't do this, and I say bullshit because I coach here in Florida at Fighting Edge Gym. We have a lot of guys that walk in to the gym off the street. They sign waivers. You can get in that ring and you can call guys in the ring and stretch them, just like they used to do in the carnies. I mean, there's with the BJJ gyms on every corner these days. You can't tell me that you can't do that,
right?
You can definitely do that. And that's the old tried and true way to teach the fans respect for professional wrestling.
I agree with you 1,000%. And then Teddy has that same mindset too with, the school that he wants to open up where, you can learn all aspects of that. You can learn shoot fighting. You can learn acrobatic stuff. You can learn, like Teddy said, learn how to conduct yourself as a professional. Teddy, and that could be a revolutionary idea to have, a building like that where you can learn all different aspects.
My prediction right now is going to be that Matt and I should get his name out on the beginning with your email. Mr. Connecticut. I think once we set up our system, and there's a few other guys involved like Kenny Lester, and I'd love to get a guy like Mr. Malenko involved. Joe Malenko is another guy that's got a really good shooter background and understands the difference of pro wrestling, learning it as a dance or learning pro wrestling as a shoot first. And it's a big difference, like how you go into this thing. And the opportunity, I think, will be presented to a lot of these athletes in the future, and they will be the ones that become world champions. And they're the ones that are going to be the guys that train both and from a young age. Yeah. You're going to see a whole hybrid generation of wrestlers that are wrestlers and wrestler shoot fighters. So they're pro wrestlers and trained as shoot fighters to be pro wrestlers, and they can do either one. And they'll be really see where Brock Lesnar I thought was an unbelievable champion, and but I still think when he got against guys, there was a group of guys out there that he just didn't have a submission training, and it wasn't because he in and out, didn't have the time to really master the shoot part of it. The submission game I think was as good as it could have been. The striking game, I thought he was not a bad striker, better than I thought he would have been. So again, I think Brock had been training MMA since he was 7, 8, like he'd been wrestling, he would have been untouchable, and he never would have lost the match because but because he lacked that one little bit Frank Mir was able to catch that leg lock on him because he didn't know how to protect against it. Where if you're running a school, the things you're going to learn at a fundamental age is how to protect the joint, how to protect the neck, how to protect your arm, how not to get put in a triangle, and not to get put in a leg lock, and not to get put in an arm bar. And these are fundamental things of self-defense to be a smart person that could easily defend themselves in any situation, except for obviously a gun or a weapon. You don't want to deal with that type of shit. But in an hand-to-hand combat situation in a bar or in a combative state of mind, you know what to do because you got these two different types of psychologies going in your mind. The great thing about pro wrestling is it teaches you to have a killer instinct, but it also teaches you kindness. And you got to have a balance. It's all about the balance. To me, in pro wrestling and shoot fighting, you put them together, it's the ultimate art. And it has so many different other types of arts that are put into that too. Like I say, it's a very multifaceted type of sport if you want to do them both right.
I have to say something too based on what Teddy was saying. That first fight with Frank Mir, where his leg was figured forward and Brock tapped out. But then the second fight, Eric Paulson taught worked with Brock on a technique series that Eric trained me on a lot, which is based on the same Stu Hart sugar hold. It's called the Stockade. And if you watch that second fight with Frank Mir just looks terrified. And I actually did a Stockade setup on Hannibal TV I've got a lot of techniques out there from my coaching at Fighting Edge from the last couple of years. And I show how to do a setup with an outside trip to a cradle to set up that Stockade. And it is a very, very effective technique. And that's the old Stu Hart setup for the sugar hole. That Stockade. And if you watch that second fight with Brock and Frank Mir, Brock was a lot more confident because Brock had fought a guy named, I think it was Ho Min Chu, a big giant Asian guy that he fought overseas before he fought Frank. And Brock won that fight. And Brock should have won that first fight with Frank Mir, but he wasn't vicious either. Like, and I with this organization that I'm working with now with CT, I'm not a big fan of punching on the ground in the face anyway, but as long as it's legal, you use it to finish. And Brock was kind of gingerly there in that first fight, and he was a little uncomfortable, but he definitely got his bearings as he progressed. And you gotta think Brock Lesnar got thrown to the wolves. He got thrown to the sharks, and he swam like an Olympic swimmer, and he won the UFC heavyweight championship. And a lot of things, and this is what Eric reminded me of when I was just out at his gym in CSW in California last year. They took over a foot of his intestines out.
Yes.
Of Brock's intestine out when he had that diverticulitis. And, I think people don't realize Eric walked away in that last fight that Brock had with Kane. Eric didn't want to be part of that because because people don't remember, they tried to keep it out of the press because your medical information is supposed to be private, but when you're a celebrity, it leaks out that Brock was having a remission with his issues with his intestines and his diverticulitis before that Cain Velasquez fight. And Eric left the camp. He goes, he shouldn't be fighting. You need to pull him out of that fight. And I think it was some of those Minnesota martial arts guys that were real greedy that said, no, we need to keep him in because it's a big money fight. They're getting their cut, right? Yeah. But I think that Brock had a tremendous career. And I don't care what anyone says. He beat Mark Hunt. Mark Hunt can cry like a baby, and use the whole steroid thing, whatever. Mark Hunt, you lost. And, Brock beat you. And I will tell you this, guys, I don't bullshit. I bet I've competed myself in MMA, never at UFC, but I've managed a number of UFC fighters, 3 Hall of Famers, and I can't name you one guy that wasn't on the shit. in MMA. So get your head out of your ass, Mark Hunt. You lost that fight. The whole and this is another thing with our fighters' rights organization. A lot of people don't understand this. This whole thing with USADA, how they stalk guys and piss test them. Going back in the contracts, when you're an independent contractor, you need to agree to that and submit to that. And we've got contracts pulled right now where that wasn't agreed to. So cha-ching, that's going to be another part of our lawsuits. So we're going after these bastards, with this organization. And that's a lot less than the CTE. Then we have another affliction that guys are suffering from being choked. I've got 2 fighters who had massive strokes that we tie into the choking. So on our side, Dana White is I'm probably going to be his least favorite person over the course of the next year.
Yeah. And speaking of CTE, and I kind of want to ask a question about Chris Benoit. I don't want to get into, the murder or all that because it's already been done to death, no pun intended. But to me, he was one of my favorites coming out of the dungeon. And I think Owen was great, Brett was great, but there was something about Benoit.
He was the best.
He was the best. That's exactly right. Maybe his intensity as well. He reminded me of another reincarnated, Dynamite Kid. Like he was a bulldog.
Way smarter and way more kind-hearted. Dynamite was a wonderful wrestler, but a prick of a person.
Yeah. No, that's true.
And I heard Dynamite was super nice when he was younger. When Dynamite was younger, I heard he was quite nice. I heard professional wrestling hated him quite a bit. I don't know why he turned this way, but he turned into a bully. Might have been the juice. He started taking the juice.
Let me tell you guys, you never know what happened behind closed doors. And I had an interesting conversation with Kevin Sullivan when Kevin was here in Florida last year. They asked me to join the Army of Darkness. So I actually joined the Army of Darkness in the pro wrestling match where I did a run-in with Andrew Anderson, because he always brings Kevin Sullivan around everywhere. But Kevin, I was a guest on Kevin's podcast, and it kind of precipitated this discussion. We talked about it. Okay, so do you guys know that Nancy had attacked and stabbed Kevin?
No.
In their relationship? Yeah, that's all. There's police reports on that. So let me just present this to you. And I think I look at things, and I told Teddy this on another matter. I don't look at things the way you guys do. Okay. I look at things a little differently because I've seen a lot of crazy shit, and things are rarely what they appear to be.
Right.
Let's just say that Benoit didn't kill his son, that Nancy killed the son, and that's when Benoit snapped and killed Nancy and killed himself. That's a distinct possibility because none of us know what the hell happened in that house.
Right.
So that's a strong possibility that could have happened. And I don't want to speak ill of the dead because I didn't know Nancy, but what I heard about her, and Kevin had to have come out and say this because he was being defamed with a lot of these dark side of the ring stuff, much like Teddy Hart was in a lot of these documentaries. Is it's documented that she had attacked him. So who knows if maybe she was violent? Who knows if maybe she killed the son? We're just we all are assuming because there's never been a trial. They're all dead, right? And maybe she attacked him after the son was killed. Who the hell knows? So, I think you kind of have to take a step back and say, you don't know what happened in that, in that instance, in that case. When 3 people are dead in a house, you can't, there's not going to be a trial because they're all dead.
Yeah. No, you're right about that. And none of us were there, and that's completely within the scope of reasonable thinking, critical thinking. That if Nancy had a violent history or had substance abuse problems and maybe was bipolar or manic depressive, you never know what she was going through. I believe Kevin when he says he was attacked. It fits what people have said about her.
Well, you don't even have to believe Kevin. I mean, there are police reports about him being stabbed. I mean, it's actually documented, right? So you don't even have to. And Kevin's not making an issue about this. He's not screaming it from the rooftops or telling me, But when he was talking to me, when we were discussing that, I thought about it, and I threw that at Kevin, and he said, brother, we don't know. Who the hell knows? You don't know what happened, right?
Yeah.
And none of us really know.
Do you think it was bullshit that they tried to explain it away on CTE?
I'm as we learn more about CTE, it's not necessarily the violence as much as it's forgetfulness and being able, maybe you could be set up more as a patsy.
Right.
But there are, spurts of anger, potentially. I think it was kind of BS that they were trying to blame it on steroids. I really wouldn't blame it so much on steroids. I would, I wouldn't necessarily blame it on anything because it kind of goes under the banner of who the hell knows what happened. And and when you if you think maybe in terms of maybe the kid was dead and maybe she was violent and maybe he killed her because she killed the kid and she came and hit. Who the hell knows? Or maybe he killed everybody and then himself. Who knows? But it really comes under the banner of, and I hate to say this because it's so old school, and I'm really old school. Is one of my biggest mantras with old school shooters is mind your own damn business, because you really don't know what the hell's going on with people, man. And I think that in today's world, everybody loves to speculate like what's going on. You don't know what the hell's going on with people, man.
True. Especially like on the road, somebody cuts you off and you flip them off or you chase them. You don't know if that guy's got a fucking gun. You don't know if he's a nut job.
I always say, I'm in Florida, and I always say, 50% of people here have guns, and I'm one of the 50%. So don't cut me off.
That's exactly right. Well, I mean, the reason I ask you about CTE is the fact that you have experience in it. And, I love Chris Nowinski. I think he's done a hell of a job, trying to bring it to everyone's attention. But to say that Chris had the brain of a 75-year-old guy with dementia it's bullshit. He wouldn't be able to function. He wouldn't be getting booked anymore. He wouldn't be in the main event of the ECW champion for WWE. Like it's he wouldn't be able to make his flights. He wouldn't be able to do anything. So I never understood the reasoning behind that.
There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes behind that. I talk to David Benoit on a regular basis. I'm good friends with David. And funny thing about Chris, I did some debunking and I talked to some police, and I have some friends at Homeland Security, and I have a few friends that are, CIA, DEA, all over. I met so many different people, especially going to Mexico. Always the Chris Benoit conversation came up, and I've heard, I'm not going to get into it too much because it's just not worth the fucking heat, but I heard a few different things about the level of stress that he was under after getting his neck surgery, which if they did all the scans on his neck, they would have done scans on his head then, which was a year and a half before that. So he was there and he was doctor's care and he was getting surgery. So I think they would have noticed if he had brain injury or brain problems, like they all of a sudden showed his brain after he died, supposedly. We don't know what the fuck we're seeing on the screen, and if it's just a huge cover up. And, I don't know what. The whole thing stunk to me. I talked to Chris about a week before that happened. He came to my house and visited me. He also brought his wife up for another visit just to visit me. He was trying to bring me in. He was trying to bring me in as one of the new guys, and he was going to bring me and Harry and I did in way back in the day when Jericho first doing the Y2J. This is right before Y2J started, and I think in that stage. I was working for WWE at that time. Natty was too, and so was TJ, and so was Harry. And we were told to shut our mouths and not say anything. I was on the list of 10 people that he tried to call. Now, again, I think that if he had that type of brain damage, it would have been something they would have noticed getting worse, and it would have been talked about as instead of all of a sudden surprise. It's like if a guy's the thief and, you know, a couple of years later, all of a sudden something goes missing. Well, the first guy you're going to think about is probably the thief that took it. Now, the reputation going to another aspect or analogy would be if Chris was suffering from problems, there would have been a little bit of a history of it. I think over the years, there would have been some outbursts or instances or him falling asleep at the wheel or missing a flight because he didn't know where he was or he had dementia. None of that seemed to be prevalent at the time. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I just know he didn't like the fucking direction of the business at that time. And I think there was a real hypocrisy going on in the business about guys being allowed to take steroids, some of the guys, and then the other guys all getting told that they couldn't take them. And that was unfair advantage. I ain't going to drop names, but everybody knows when everyone else is looking like shit and those guys are looking like $1 million, there's 4 or 5 guys in the company that are allowed to do what they want, and the rest of the guys are all treated like dog shit. And that ruined, I watched, that was the era when all the guys went down. And you take away steroids, and you add alcohol and cocaine and other drugs because you could pass the piss test with those other drugs in 2 or 3 days. And what marijuana can't. And you know, I know Chris told me about that if they just let all the guys smoke weed, most guys wouldn't have been so fucked up. And
True.
He wasn't a smoker, but his opinion of the that marijuana was just starting to become cool and more. He said that medical marijuana would probably save the next generation of wrestlers. Well, guess what? WWE now allows their wrestlers to smoke marijuana, and I know for sure helping with getting the guys out of the bars and off the coke and off the fucking pills, which is why I've said to myself, I've dedicated my life in wrestling to expand the horizons of what the human body is capable of doing. And one of the reasons I was able to do that is because I learned the hard way watching all my friends and heroes and my family die from drug overdoses and from abuse of prescription medication, mostly opiates and cocaine and steroids. If anything, kept them alive for a few years longer than what it would have because they destroyed their bodies. The other thing about professional wrestling, if Chris Benoit did snap, well, Chris Benoit was on the road for 20 years straight, guys, because he was in Japan that whole time. And Japan's a whole other level of hell and a whole other level of hard. And every match you have down there, solid. It's stiff, it's snug, it's totally different. Benoit broke his bread in Japan. Jericho broke his bed in Japan and Mexico. There's a reason that these guys have that respect because if you go to Mexico, you better know how to fucking wrestle. And if you go to Japan, you better be tough and you better know how to wrestle and shoot. And if you don't, they'll teach you real quick. And if you don't learn the lesson, you're going to end up on the mat and you're going to end up going home. And you will not get the Japanese massage in the shower, and you will not get the fucking acclaim of wrestling in front of everybody at New Japan in front, at the Tokyo Dome in front of 80,000 people or something. It's a real reward when you can come out of Japan and then you go to WCW and he's the meat and potatoes. He's the guy that has to have good match after good match after good match. I don't think I ever saw Chris Benoit have a bad match. And I don't think I really ever saw Hart have a bad match, which is, like I say, and they finally got to wrestle each other. I was thinking, shit, that's 5 years too late, 10 years too late. I never got to see Brett versus Eddie Guerrero either, or versus The Rock, or versus Triple H in that capacity, where there's so many good matches coming up when Benoit joined the WWE. But he'd been wrestling for 20 years straight, guys, plus the Stampede. He was on the road all the time. So if he wore out or he snapped, I think it's because the schedule is it's so demanding that it makes people it's you have to have an off season. You have to have some time for these guys to transition into some kind of break period. They can relax and then they can go back. But it's a drug. It's an addiction. It's an addiction being on TV and being on top and looking good and walking out to the ring and feeling those fans and working that magic and coming in the back. But once you're in the back, it's not the NFL. It's not the NBA. It's not as organized, and you don't travel as a team. You travel by yourself. And the fucking fastest way to take out a really tough guy, a real fucking killer, in a good way, not bad way, but a good way, to take him out is to leave him by himself. Nobody wants to be alone, and nobody wants to travel alone. And the reason the camaraderie among the fucking wrestlers that live in the same city, they'd all be buddies, and they're all clicked up because they all lived in the same city. They travel together. But anyone that was traveling outside of the little group from either Florida, New York area was traveling by themselves. And I think loneliness destroys a lot of wrestlers. Bret Hart talked about it in Wrestling with Shadows. how lonely he was walking down the hallways after the shows are over. All the adrenaline's gone. You got 2 hours to sleep before you got to catch your next flight. And you get to the next flight, it's not like you're getting picked up in a fucking limo. You're getting picked up by nobody. You got to get a rental car and drive yourself to the fucking show instead of having a chauffeur. How do you know you didn't get your ass kicked the night before and you could barely see, or you got to question and you can barely think, and then you're forced to drive 4 hours to an indie show or to a non-TV taping because you have TV tapings, then you have house shows. It's like, well, shit, all that stuff to me is no. And I understand Vincent's a business, but it's like it's people are so fucking greedy, and they have such a lack of empathy and understanding for the athletes. They're treating them like fucking race horses. And when the race horse is done, they put a fucking slug in them and turn them into dog food.
Yeah. Do you guys think, thinking back now to when this happened with Benoit, that it was a big miscalculation? Because if you look at what had happened, you've got a house, right, with 3 dead people. For WWE or WWF, I think at that time, to have done a whole special that night on Chris Benoit, when it would seem to indicate that he may have at least murdered someone in that house, right? So do you guys think that they made a big mistake in doing that special that night?
I think somebody knew exactly what had happened, or at least had an inkling of what happened, and knew it wasn't Chris's fault. And before the news was able to break, they at least want to give him his due and give him a proper send-off.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. I like to think that too, that they knew it was time up. This was the last hurrah for him, and they knew the society the way it was better than anybody. They got the thumb on the pulse of these people. They've created this for this woke movement. A lot of the WWE stuff allowed these guys to have a voice that are completely morons out there, absolute morons that have no clue and should not have an opinion about anything, especially to judge me on my personal life and tell me I can't work my job because of something that happened in my personal life. I'd love to go into their house, watch them for a week, and see them fuck up, and then tell them they can't go to their job as a carpenter, or they're not allowed to be a truck driver anymore because they fucking got in a fight with their wife. And they fucking looked at a girl wrong, or somebody said that guy sent a text to them that was vulgar or sexual. It's like, well, fuck, dude, you guys are taking away all these people's living ability to make money. Let me go into your world. You've entered mine now, and you're deciding you're judge, jury, and executioner. Let me go watch a few guys, and you had a few too many drinks. Guess what? You're suspended from work for 6 months. I got 10 people signing a paper on Twitter saying you're a bad guy. I met you for 5 minutes. I didn't realize your dad died. You were crazy as you've been dealing with fucking stress or trauma, or you got into a car accident, you had a bad back. Who the fuck are all these fans to judge us on what happened? And I think the WWE knew that the fans were like that, and that they would judge Benoit, so they gave him the last raw, which I thought was well deserved because they erased him after that. And I understand that partially, the reaction to that, but at the same time, let's say it wasn't and he didn't have a clue what he was doing. It was a complete accident type of thing, or he wasn't himself, which sounds like I say, that was the story. I don't know the other story. I just know what might happen or what could happen. If it should have happened was I think it was well deserved. I mean, I don't want to glorify what he did, but I think it was one of those situations where I'm glad he got that last moment on TV where they get the lead, because he really was one of the greatest wrestlers in the history of wrestling, and he's been forgotten about, and he's not talked about in that same capacity now. It's a shame, because what you do on the outside of the ring, yeah, definitely you're held accountable for it. But I like to think that, you would still get the credit for what you did as a wrestler and an artist. Some of these artists, that maybe they've done crazy shit, but their art's still up in a museum, and I think that would be the same thing with Chris. His art should still be in the museum, still be in the Hall of Fame.
I mean, you think about the possibility, maybe if he had survived, like if he didn't kill himself, where would we be? We'd actually have some light into what actually happened, because like I said, I mean, there's a possibility. I say this, and I want to parse this because I'm not, but you can understand, and I think all of us guys can understand when I tell you that story about what happened with Kevin Sullivan, which has been documented, that sometimes women that you're with might attack you and you might. It's not so much snapping. You might just react, right? And they might, maybe you accidentally in their lives, whatever it may be. But I think the thing that the fans can never forgive is someone killing their own child. And that's why I say, and that's what I thought about it. But then after talking to Kevin, I started thinking about it more critically. And I said, well, you don't know what the hell happened in that house. Maybe he didn't kill the child, and maybe he snapped the wife after the child was dead. So if he was alive now, we would know. And it was such a brutal way that he hanged himself, with the weights, in there. It was kind of wild.
There's a lot of theories about that stuff being completely impossible to happen. There was all these other stories. I've heard so many different mixed stories. That's why I don't throw around a lot of, we'll say, piercing or opinions on stuff that there's no. Because you're Mr. Connecticut and you have a certain level of respect in the real world and you're a lawyer, so I think you would be one person that actually subjectively kind of looks at 5 different reasons or what could have happened and explored. For most people, I'd say don't touch the issue of the 10-foot fucking pole. We don't know what happened, and I don't want to speculate, and I don't want to make an asset every time you do it. Like I say again, I think it could have been either, really, in my opinion, 2 things: either she got real violent with him, something happened, and maybe by accident in some capacity she hit her head or fell or something, and it was a type of, and he panicked after that. But again, maybe not. Maybe somebody else fucking murdered the guy. Who knows? Maybe someone came to his house and killed him. Who the fuck knows why? And how many crazy wrestling fans are out there? I don't understand, and I don't know. And I don't want to think like that. But I mean, the realm of possibilities is fucking endless. You'll drive yourself nuts,
Sure. But I think in a case like that, if you want to look at it critically, you do have to look at the past. And I didn't know this until I talked to Kevin with her, and it's documented. So let's get off that. That's a really gruesome subject, and not one. But Benoit had some great matches. He used to have some great matches with Kurt Angle as well.
Thanks for listening to Rebuilding the Foundation with Teddy Hart. To keep up with the latest happenings with Teddy, follow him on Instagram at official Teddy Hart. You can also email us at rebuildingthefoundationpodcast@gmail.com. Join us next time for Rebuilding the Foundation with Teddy Hart, right here on the Rad Rob Radio Network.